Alright, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, YouTube. I got a new microphone, so this might sound a little different. I hope it actually works and you can hear anything at all. Alright, before we get started, I'm going to bring up kind of a different topic, not to do with Galatians specifically, but to do with just reading the Bible. Um, I'm reading out of the King James Version. Now, I'm going to say something here, is that I don't think there's any one perfect version of the translation of the Bible. Most of the time I do prefer to use the King James Version, because that's what I was brought up on. But these verses specifically are a little bit difficult to understand in the King James Version. So I'm actually going to be going to the Amplified version. It's the AMPC, the Amplified Classic Edition, because it expands on the original language more, and I think it does a better job at getting the point across of what Paul's trying to say here. I don't, I haven't used a lot of different versions of the Bible. Most of the time, I'll take the King James and then I'll go to Amplified if I have some confusion. But I don't believe there's any one perfect translation. I think, unless you're reading the original Greek, which, you know, very few people probably know how to do, and I don't think that's even required to do. It's not You're not going to get a perfect translation because the amplified version, which I'm going to go to here, I think could be the closest, but it sometimes expands a little too much where it becomes a little difficult to read. But anyway, I just wanted to get that out of the way and say that I'm going to be jumping to the amplified to try to explain a couple things in this chapter. But welcome back for week 2, and let's get right into it. In Galatians chapter 2. Then, 14 years after I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, I took Titus with me also, and I went up by revelation, and communicated with them the gospel which I preached among the Gentiles, but privately to them that were of reputation, lest by any means I should run, or had run, in vain. So as chapter 2 says, Paul went up privately to the people that were, in high positions, in, positions of reputation. So that, as, it says he shouldn't, run or had run in vain. In Amplified, it explains that he says, for I wanted to make certain by thus at first confining my communication to the private conference, so I was not running in vain, guarding against being discredited either in what I had planned or what I was planning to do. So what it's saying is, he went to the people in power before explaining his, what he was going to do to the masses, so that, there wouldn't be any rumors floating around of what he had come here to do. It's almost like if you're going to tell something to your boss at work, if you tell it to all the employees first, it might get around to your boss in some weird twisted story before you have a chance to tell them. So like he's saying, they came secretly at first to tell the people in leadership before, any rumors could get out. But neither Titus, who was with me, being a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised, and that because of false brethren unawares brought in, who came in privily to spy out our liberty which we have in Jesus Christ, that they might bring us into bondage. Alright, so now we get to a part that's a little bit complicated to understand. But I guess it's not really. It's just if you haven't heard it before, it might confuse you. It's when he starts talking about the circumcision and the uncircumcision. What he's talking about here is the fact that Jesus came unto the Jewish people, and the Jewish people followed the law of Moses, and part of their law was to be circumcised. What he's trying to explain here and get across is that, like the circumcised people he's talking about are the Jewish people. The uncircumcised are the Gentiles, or the people that never followed the law of Moses. The people who are classified as sinners under the old law. So the whole thing of the circumcision is that it's not necessary anymore to follow the old Mosaic law, as the Jews did. Saying, the uncircumcised people are no different anymore. Because since we're living through Christ's sacrifice on the cross, and he's fulfilled the law for us, the old Mosaic law has no power anymore. People who are still under bondage of the law, they're still under bondage of believing that being circumcised is required to follow God. And he says, Titus he wasn't compelled to be circumcised, even though there were people that had, come in and tried to make others believe that it was still required. People had, snuck in secretly. They were, in a way, jealous of the liberty they had in Christ. That, by believing in Jesus Christ, they were not under bondage of the law of you had to be circumcised, or you had to, do stuff a certain way. It's the people that they don't want to give up their power. They don't want to give up their leadership and admit that people are saved without works. People are saved by the grace of Christ and the grace of Christ alone. To whom we gave place by subjection, no, not for an hour, that the truth of the gospel might continue with you. As he says in verse 5, we didn't submit to them for a moment. We didn't give them any time out of our day. It's like, you're preaching a false gospel, so you're not of us, you're not with us, you're not preaching Christ. You're trying to keep people under bondage of a law that benefits you because then you become in command. But of those who seem to be somewhat, whatsoever they were, it makes no matter to me, God accepts no man's person. For they who seem to be somewhat in conference added nothing to me. In the King James it says, oh, people that seem to be somewhat. In other translations it means, somewhat of power. People that seem to be, in a position of power. That, had twisted people to believe they were of more importance than them. He's saying, God doesn't care who you are. God doesn't care about your position of power. God doesn't care about what title you have. If you have, a PhD before your name, everyone's a person. Everybody's a sinner. It doesn't matter, what position you hold. God doesn't look at any of that. But contrariwise, when I saw that the gospel of the uncircumcision was committed unto me, as the gospel of the circumcision was unto Peter. For he that wrought effectively in Peter to the apostleship of the circumcision, the same was mighty in me towards the Gentiles. And when James, Cephas, and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that was given unto me, they gave to me and Barnabas the right hands of fellowship, that we should go unto the heathen, and they unto the circumcision. Only they would that we should remember the poor, the same which I also was forward to do. But once they saw that God was actually working through Paul, once they saw that he was to be sent on to the uncircumcised, sent on to, the Gentiles, as they call them, the people who never lived under the old law, then they were a little bit more accepting of them. Once they, actually recognized that God was working through him. And again, I don't know how much time it took, but it's like sometimes stuff, people, it's hard to accept a new way of thinking. It's hard to go away from something you've been living through your entire life. Once they had recognized that, so, James, Cephas, and John, they were, they had a reputation in the church. They gave, their blessing onto them. So, it's saying like at first they were probably a bit hesitant of it. But then, after they saw that, okay, God is actually working in Paul, they were more accepting then. But when Peter was come to Antioch, I withstood him to the face, because he was to be blamed. For before that certain came from James, he did eat with the Gentiles. But when they were come, he withdrew and separated himself, fearing them that were of the circumcision. And the other Jews disassembled likewise with him, insomuch that Barnabas was also carried away with their dissimulation. When Peter, came to Antioch, that they had a quarrel, they had a debate. Because when Peter was on his own with the Gentiles, the people who didn't believe in the law that was necessary, he was fine with them. Peter was, fine. He was dining with them. He was eating with them. But then as soon as the people that he knew came that believed in the circumcision, the people that believed that you had to be under the law, Peter, withdrew from the lawless people and, acted like, they were beneath him. He acted, more in line with people who said, the law is necessary. You need to do this. You need to be circumcised. Because he was afraid of what they would think of him. So Peter's saying, he withstood him to the face, as he puts it. He said, in Peter doing that, he caused a bunch of other Jews, a bunch of other of the people who believed in the law, to fall back into their own ways of saying, yeah, the law is necessary. Saying, while they were a bit accepting of the people who were not under the law at first, when Peter fell back into saying the law is necessary, fell back into the old way, a lot of other people came with him. It's, just showing, actions of one man can have ripple effects, where just because you think that, you have the right to do anything of your life, it can be amazing how much you can affect other people with your decisions and your choices. Whenever you make a decision, you're not only making it for you, you're most of the time making it for your family, either, your spouse, you can make it for your children, you're making it for your siblings, because people and people that see you are going to be influenced by you. So just, don't think that your choices are yours alone. The choices you make have impacts that go beyond yourself. But when I saw that they walked not uprightly according to the truth of the gospel, I said unto Peter before them all, If thou, being a Jew, lives after the manner of the Gentiles, and not as do the Jews, why compellest thou the Gentiles to live as Jews? We who are Jews by nature, and not sinners of the Gentiles, knowing that a man is not justified by the works of the law, but by the faith of Jesus Christ. Even we have believed in Jesus Christ, that we might be justified by the faith of Christ, and not by the works of the law. For by the works of the law shall no flesh be justified. He's saying, if you're a Jew, if you've been born under the law, live after the manner of people who are without the law, and not as the people under the law, then why are you telling the Gentiles, why are you telling the people without the law that they must come under the subjection of the law. Like, it's you yourself know that the law does not save you, yet you're telling people that the law is required. He's saying, what are you doing? He's saying you're doing this out of fear of the people who you're with, out of fear of looking like an outcast, by saying, oh, the law is not necessary. Because people lived under the law so much, they were still in that idea of the law is required to be justified. But he's saying, we who are Jews by nature, we who, were born under the law and not sinners of the Gentiles, not born outside the law, outside of God's, chosen people, saying we know that a man is not justified by the works of the law, but by faith in Jesus Christ. Saying, we believe in Jesus Christ that we might be justified by the faith in Christ, and not by the works of the law. For by the works of the law, no flesh shall be justified. He's saying here, no work can justify you. And he's being very clear with this. He's not, saying, oh, works don't do much for you. He's saying, no, nothing. If you're believing that performing a work is what justifies you in the eyes of God, you're not fully understanding the sacrifice that Christ made for you. Because the whole thing of Christ dying on the cross was to be the one sacrifice needed. That belief in Him alone is the only thing that justifies you in the eyes of God. That trusting and believing in Christ is the only thing that can actually save you. But if, while we seek to be justified by Christ, we ourselves are found to be sinners, is therefore Christ the minister of sin? God forbid. For if I build again the things which I destroyed, I make myself a transgressor. For I through the law am dead to the law, that I might live unto God. I am crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live, yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. In the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God, who loved me, and gave himself for me. I do not frustrate the grace of Christ. For if righteousness come by the law, then Christ is dead in vain. If we claim that Christ is the only thing that justifies us, and that we are justified in Christ, he's like, if we sin, does that mean that, Christ sins? If we're claiming to live completely through Christ, but we still sin, does that make Christ a sinner? Does that make, say that, oh, he's, making us sin through him? Saying, God forbid, that's not at all what's happening. Because he's saying, if I sin in the body, if by works sin, that doesn't make Christ's sacrifice any less. That doesn't make Christ, the one who's sinning in me. Christ, you're justified through the sacrifice of Christ, and any works you do come from your flesh. So if you sin in the works of your flesh, that doesn't nullify the work of Christ, because Christ has nothing to do with your flesh. The sacrifice of Christ is separate from the works of your flesh, and that's why it's so important to make a separation, because if you make Christ's sacrifice a work, then you make it equal with your own works and your own sins you can commit. Yet, if you recognize fully that the death of Christ on the cross is outside of your own works, it's outside of your own power, and is the only to be able to be accepted, then the sins you do have no power over it, because the sins you do are works of your flesh, and Christ's sacrifice has nothing to do with your flesh. So he's saying, the sacrifice of Christ, you're not to frustrate. He says, I do not frustrate the grace of God. For if the righteousness comes by the law, then Christ is dead in vain. If Christ's sacrifice is part of the law, if belief in Christ is a work, then it's useless. It's useless, because then it has no merit, no more power than any other work of the law. The only way the sacrifice of Jesus Christ can work is if it's outside of works, if it's outside of the law. And it's something that a lot of people, they can try to confuse by saying, oh yeah, you need Christ's sacrifice and you need to do these works. Through believing in God and through loving God, you will want to do good works. But never are those good works required. They can't be. Because if they're required, if good works are required, that must mean that good works have something to do with salvation. And that must mean that the sacrifice of Christ on the cross is a work for us to perform. And that's just not the case. That can't be the case, or else it's invalid. And that's not the case, and that can't be the case, or else, as he says, then Christ is dead in vain. Alright, I feel like that one was a lot longer than my last video. I hope we were able to get through that okay. I know I went on a few rambles near the end, trying to explain some of those ideas. I'm hoping I can cut those down in post-production. We'll see what happens. If I need to, if while I'm editing I realize I need to elaborate any more, I'll probably splice some things in, which you already would have heard. So I don't even know why I'm telling you this right now. Anyway, thanks for surviving through another one of these videos, and Lord willingly, I'll see you all next week.